This is a podcast on complexity thinking. Until now, all episodes have been in Finnish. This time, however, the language is English. Our guest today is Professor Stig Johannessen. He is a professor at the University and Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway. Stig's research is focused on organizational dynamics, complexity, strategic and operational leadership, and innovation. Tomorrow, Stig will deliver a keynote address at the annual Finnish Conference on Public Administration and Local Government, hosted this year by the National Defense University. The topic of his keynote is Strategies, Leadership and Complexity in Crisis. We would like to thank the Finnish Association for Administrative Studies and Finnish Association of Local Government Studies for making this podcast episode possible. Welcome to the podcast, Stig.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome also on my behalf.
Thank you.
So you have been doing research on complexity for quite some time. Do you still remember how you first learned about complexity as a scientific concept? And did you get excited about complexity then right away?
I think I learned about complexity the first time when I was studying physics, because the ideas of complexity, although it's been around for a long time in very many different types of areas. I studied physics in the 1980s, and of course, when you study, the universe and the atomic world and all this stuff, you get into complexity. And much of the ideas from complexity thinking, like we are talking about it today, comes from the natural sciences. So then I was in the industry for a number of years, and I came back to university to do a PhD in organizational studies, and I discovered they had taken up much of that language from the natural sciences and started to explain things in the social world or in organizational studies. And then I was excited because I recognize this language and these ideas. I also thought it was very interesting because much of the traditional ideas I've found quite, idealistic and really, I would say, maybe even boring and not very realistic. While at that point, now we're talking about in the late 90s, starting to talk about complexity, they talked about the world that we experience in a much more realistic way, I thought. So that was my first experience with the complexity sciences.
For me, the year was 2006, so you were much more earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you know, there are several schools of complexity, and there is basically no one correct definition of complexity which is shared by all. How do you define complexity? And I know that you have been working with Professor Rolf Stacey, for example, and I assume that it has influenced your understanding of the issue.
Indeed, yes. My understanding of the complexity in the social world, in the organizational studies, I've been much influenced by Professor Stacey and other colleagues working in the same area. I think perhaps it's very difficult to talk about any sort of definitions in the social sciences because we are living, if we are living in a complex world, as we probably agree, things are moving around, And for me, definitions is all about pinning things down to a certain fact or to a certain, idea that you may maybe find in the natural sciences. That, gravitation, you can define what it is. While in the social world, it's much more difficult because as you have been defining things, you can ask someone else and they have some other ideas about it. And then you say there are a lot of definitions, but maybe we shouldn't define it as much, but rather talk about what kind of phenomena are involved in when we are talking about complexity. And for me, on a general basis, it's all about interactions. So it's about what happens when something or someone interacts. We have this in the natural sciences, of course, where you can say when in the atomic world, when atoms interact, something happens. But now we're talking about the social world, when people interact, and what happens when people interact with each other. And all these sorts of phenomena that happens, and we're trying to explain or describe, belong to the world of complexity, I think. So interaction is one. Another one is the idea of emergence, which is quite difficult thing to explain, but it has something to do with things growing and appearing at the same time. So if something can be sort of hidden, but bubbling in a pot, and suddenly it boils over. And this particular phenomenon in the social world, we can recognize also that suddenly things happens that we start to think, where did that come from? And we start to investigate it, and it didn't just happen. It was all sorts of things that were happening before this. So this idea of emergence, I think, is very important in this way of thinking. And then it's all about non-linearity, or the non-linear world that we live in, which has something to do with causality, that things are not just straightforward. So if one thing happens, it's you cannot predict necessarily what will happen next. And of course, you have the idea of self-organization, which also is a quite difficult concept to explain, because people tend to maybe think about self-organization as when you leave a group to organize itself, but it's not about that really. In this sense, it's everything that we experience is self-organized. So it has to do with all the other phenomenons, that when people interact, something happens that you might call organized. And whatever happens, it is self-organizing, because it tends to be not one person organizing the others, but everyone is involved in some sort of organizing. So I think these are the main topics. And then we try to translate that into ordinary, everyday experiences, link it to, for instance, power relations, link it to communication. What does this mean when you talk about communication? Link it to ethics. What does it mean when people interact and produce ethics? And I think that is the link between complexity thinking and social sciences. This was a very long answer, but it is really a different way of thinking about things than compared to what you will find in ordinary textbooks, let's say.
Yeah. You had a long answer, but at the same time, you pinpointed out the main words or the main concepts.
Yes.
That you can operate with four main concepts. And I think this will help our listeners to understand this rather difficult way of thinking.
You talked about how the ideas of complexity have been transferred from natural sciences to social sciences, and when one reads about complexity thinking, complex science, there's usually critique of this transfer. Do you consider it justified?
Well, it depends on what sort of critique. I think originally, when people started to work on, now I'm talking about maybe as early as the 1980s or early 1990s, start to work on the social ideas around complexity, it was a tendency maybe to directly transfer it into the social sciences, like when people said was working on different kind of complex adaptive systems, for instance. They were studying, let's say, flocks of birds. You know, when you see the flock of birds, and so organizing can happen without a leading bird. There's no chief bird in the flock, or there's no chief ant in the when you see a colony of ants. So he started to think about or discovered in the natural sciences that this has something to do with how they react to the neighboring bird or ant or whatever. And it was very simple rules for how they did this. And then people started to translate this. Okay, if we have an organization or a business and we just have two simple rules, then everything will be okay. And this sort of direct translation, I think, it was justified to criticize. What caught more on to me when Ralph Stacey and his colleagues started to think about this was that they started with the social sciences. And they started with the social sciences and they looked for thinkers, philosophers, sociologists, and so forth, social theorists, that had been talking about these things without using those words. So they could actually just say that, well, this is actually what this person is talking about. So let's say, for instance, George Herbert Mead, the American pragmatist that was talking about emergence, talking much about paradox, the social interactional school in sociology. And if you study him now with the eyes of the complexity theory, you would say, okay, this is what he's talking about. So you can just sort of develop his thoughts further into organizational studies. So I think that way of doing it have been very interesting and fruitful.
In this podcast, we have before been talking about, for example, of Mary Parker Follett and Karl von Clausewitz,
right,
who could be considered as prophets of complexity.
In a way, yes.
They talked about complexity, even though they didn't use the concepts of complexity. So, Stig, can you tell our listeners what kind of research you have done on complexity in general? You have published quite a lot on this topic.
Well, I think initially I did my PhD and was very inspired by this new idea. So I didn't really develop any ideas on my own. I just picked up these ideas and tried to use them in some sort of empirical context. And I did my PhD on strategy processes in the industry, trying to understand how strategies were emerging in an industrial context. And then I moved on to study innovation processes in big industry, not the entrepreneurial side of it, but when big industry innovate, how do they do that? And it wasn't until I started to work on crisis that I realized that there was something new to be said about complexity ideas, and maybe I would then develop some new theoretical ideas also that I would speak a little bit about tomorrow, that has to do with the time dimension in strategy and in practices. I call them practices, the things people do in the organizations, and they do different things, and all these practices they enter into conflict with each other. And I've been thinking a lot about why does these conflicts arise, and it occurred to me when I was looking at crisis that it has to do with time dimensions within the practices, the rhythms, so to speak. So if you're in the bureaucracy, there is a particular rhythm that is not the same as if you're in an operational area. And the thing is that in crisis and emergency organization, you have both of this together, and they come into conflict with each other. But it has to do with how people experience time in this in these particular practices they are doing, and I think this track I want to explore more in the time ahead. And I haven't seen so much about that, so that might be a contribution to the theory. But on the empirical side, I think there is a lot to do about using these ideas to understand the dynamics of organizations, various kinds of organizations in various areas.
So one of your recent publications is a book published by Routledge in 2018. I have read it, and it's an excellent book.
Thank you very much.
So in this book titled Strategies, Leadership and Complexity in Crisis and Emergency Operations, you use a complexity theoretical framework to study organizational practices during crises and emergencies. The two cases you compare in the book are the police operation in response to the 2011 terrorist attacks in Norway and the military response to the Libyan crisis. As Brigadier General Mika Kalliomaa was a guest in our last podcast episode, and we focused then on the complexity of warfare, this time we could focus more on the role of the police. So could you tell us about this case, even just on a general level? Like, what did you learn when you analyzed the police operation from the complexity perspective, and how complexity helps us understand what happened during the police operation?
Well, it's a very complicated case because it's so many details. But basically what happened was that there was a twin terrorist attack in 2011 in Norway, where there was a bomb in the government quarters, and that was followed by a mass shooting on an island on a youth camp. And it turned out to be the same person. It was what we now call a solo terrorist doing both of these attacks. And as this happened, it seemed, I think, to people that it was quite an efficient police operation, because it didn't take that long until he was arrested, maybe 1 hour. And when you see it in relation to many other police operations, it seemed like it was quite efficient. The problem was that in this hour, this person managed to kill 69 people and hurt many others. So there was an investigation, and the investigation ended up criticizing harshly the police for being very inefficient in that police operation. And there was a big report on that. And I was interested in, at that point, actually, I was doing studies on the police culture, and one of the conclusions in the report was that there was something wrong with the police culture. So I was just in the middle of that particular project, and when that report came, and I decided to move a little bit closer into that project and see, or into that case, and see what was happening. So what I discovered was that there was major problems with the coordination within the police, and it had to do with many different units within the police reacting at the same time. And it didn't seem like they were trained to be coordinated. Although they had a formal body or a formal organization that was supposed to coordinate it, everything in this organization fell apart. So you might say the formal hierarchy fell apart. And the similarity with the military case was that it seemed like in both cases it was the operational element that fell apart. So if you think about in a more formal way, that the strategic level, the top leaders, and the tactical level, you have the people doing the job on the ground. There is a coordinating level between, and that level fell apart. And in the military case, that didn't matter that much because the tactical level was coordinating themselves. In the police case, that was not the case. They didn't manage to coordinate themselves. They were much more dependent on the hierarchy. And this resulted then in different questions about why did this happen in the police. And one of the explanations then from complexity could be that there was actually a very strong clash between the practices, between the bureaucratic practice and the operational practice, but also that you have two hierarchies within the police. You have a formal hierarchy and then you have an expert hierarchy. And there was also a clash between them on the operational level. So, for instance, the special anti-terrorist unit, they are the experts and they're supposed to react in these cases. But also the local police are supposed to react, but they are not the experts. But the local operational central are supposed to coordinate the experts. And in that relationship, something very, very wrong happened, or so this just collapsed. And it ended with that they lost maximum 30 minutes. So in that 30 minutes, they and this even the report said that they could have been on the island maybe 20 to 30 minutes earlier. And that doesn't seem much, but when you know that 27 people were killed in those 20 minutes,
young people,
young people, then you realize that this was actually a big deal. And no police operation is perfect, but we would probably expect that it would be done a little bit better than that. But it had to do with the coordination effects and all these things we have been talking about, really.
Maybe we could take now the question on well-being issues and then continue with the future of complexity.
Yeah, you read my mind. I was, while listening to you, there are so many ideas. Before you said, or earlier you said that linking these four main concepts, for instance, to power. I wonder what these. How do you see? These four main concepts: interaction, emergent, that something happens, emerges, non-linearity, and self-organization. Have you thought how these are linking to well-being at work? Maybe it's a bit difficult question, but it arose my
I think
curiosity.
Yeah, sure, and I think the relevance, whatever you're talking about, because you were asking maybe whether I've been working on the well-being, and I think when we have been working on development processes within organizations, this is always an issue, and it has to do with quality. And part of the thinking within the complexity theories, at least the strands there we are talking about now, when we talk about interaction, has to do with relationships between people. So it is really relationships between people we are talking about. We don't go around saying, I have an interaction with you. It's very technical, but it is the type of relationships. And these relationships are formed by communication, basically. And when people communicate and form these relationships, power issues arise. So differences between influence and all sorts of things that you might associate with power, but also identity issues, thoughts you might have about who you are or where you belong, what sort of group you belong to, and all these things are linked into the relationship issue. So the way I see it, well-being, and at one point you might say that maybe it is not good that people are feeling well all the time, because also in the complexity we are talking about paradox. You cannot decide how people should feel, and from time to time could be good not to feel well. And we know this from innovation, for instance. The struggles. Some people like, when they are working with innovation, the struggles, the fights, working towards the win, and all these things. But some people don't like it. And it could be absolutely the same situation that for some people they thrive and like it, and other people really dislike it. And I think for leaders in particular, it is probably some of the main things is to catch what different people feel in different situations, so that different people can get to do what they are best at and what they like the most. So you don't get a person who is who dislike uncertainty to do uncertain things, maybe and the other way around. So I think the whole quality of the relations and the quality of the communication, quality of the powers, actually quality of power relations, and all this has to do with this issue you are talking about, I think.
It's so nice to hear that kind of words, because my background is in social psychology, and I know all these MEAD and it's all about interaction and influencing each other, right. and it's all about relations. So I think we should dig a whole lot deeper this complexity thinking and related to social psychology. And again to organization psychology, social psychology.
Sure.
And I was wondering that you were talking about this individual level, but I wonder how does this complexity thinking in well-being at work operates in an organizational level in leading people's well-being at work? Because you have to manage all the processes that provide well-being and all the cost that comes from being not so well. I think there are the main complex concepts at your hand at the same time. That you should operate on so many levels.
That's true, and I think being a leader today, at least in a large organization, it is very, very difficult because there is this expectations that leaders should, manage everything in an organization, and that comes back maybe to an underlying idea that leaders should be in control in some way, that they should that they are responsible for everything that happens in the organization. I think one of the things that complexity thinking teaches us is that we should probably stop thinking about it in that way, because it's impossible for a leader to be responsible for everything that happens.
Yeah, exactly.
He or she could, of course, be responsible in a moral way. That is, say, when something happens in an organization, it is my responsibility, no matter if I had something to do with it or not. But also to build personal responsibilities in an organization is one of the most important things, I think. And I think we see it in Norway, in many, many public organizations, how people flee from their responsibilities, and they point to some abstraction, and they say it's all about the system. So it's a system error when something happens. They say it has nothing to do with me. But I think leaders who work on the feeling of responsibility within the organization I think they will succeed better, and we have some great examples of that actually in the literature.
Yeah, and also you mentioned this coordination in your case. You mentioned earlier. I think there's also a lot to learn from.
Absolutely, yes.
This modern leadership. But Harri, your turn.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the future. So Stig, how do you see the development of complexity thinking in the future? How does its role evolve as part of organizational studies? And what about in practice? Are different societal actors beginning to understand complexity better? At least in Finland, you hear the word complexity everywhere nowadays. You cannot go to a seminar or conference that you don't hear the word. So it's becoming quite a trendy subject.
Sure, and you cannot escape complexity as a phenomenon. So that is probably, no matter what we do or what scientists do, or trying to explain this or trying to influence the understanding, people will experience the world of complexity because we live in what we might call a complex world, which means not only that it is, which has this particular meaning in complexity thinking that maybe the popular word doesn't catch, but it means that we live in a non-linear world. There is no direct connection between cause and effect. There are very few things that have direct connection between cause and effect. So we don't live in an instrumental world. And that is a very important issue to be learned, because when you see in different kind of organizations, in the public sector at least, politicians and others, they are always talking about how they are going to fix things in an instrumental way. And they use the bureaucracy, of course, because that's their tool, to fix this in an instrumental way. But and this has immense effects because they are doing all these sorts of reforms. In Norway, we have, after the police operation there in 2011, they had a big police reform. The whole police, all of Norway, was going to change because the police in Oslo didn't do their job. So, it's this generalization and instrumentalization of ideas. If you believe that you live in a non-linear world, you just cannot do that. You will understand that it is a waste of resources, it's a waste of money, a waste of people, it's a waste of well-being. People get sick, all sorts of things happens as a result of this instrumental way of thinking. So we should just stop it, So that is a big consequence, and I think very many people feel that and think about that, but there, in some weird way, we haven't gotten to the point where we are just stopping doing all this instrument. There's a big belief in instrumentalism at the top level. So you're asking about different societal actors, and I can also say that in Norway, complexity thinking in studies of organization is not a big deal. There's very large conservatism within that field, but internationally, or if you take all the different countries, there is a big interest in this. Mm-hmm. And I also find that there are a growing number of leaders that are interested in this. So you will find just as much interest in with leaders than you will find among researchers. So I don't know about the future. You cannot predict the future, but you cannot escape complexity. It will turn even more complex because complexity has to do with interactions, and now we also interact with all the technology. So all the interactions grow in the numbers. That means that complexity also grows.
You will meet some of Finnish complexity, leaders who embrace complexity, like today evening and tomorrow. So I would like to think that in Finland we are getting better at acknowledging complexity, but we have much work to do still, as in Norway. And it would be great to network better on like complexity research, because in Finland the group is getting bigger and bigger. Researchers who are interested on the topic, but I think we are not like well enough connected.
Well, you used to have the slogan "connecting people," didn't you?
Yes.
And disconnecting families.
That's true. So we usually ask at the end of the podcast one more personal question. So Stig, has familiarizing yourself with complexity in a way influenced your everyday life? Because there is this saying that the shoemaker's children go barefoot. So do you consider yourself in a way truly applying the philosophy or the principles of complexity?
Yeah, my children don't go barefoot. They haven't done that. But I have 3 sons, and they are all now grown-ups and seem to do well. So I must have done something right. I guess you cannot just apply this kind of thinking. I think the way you think about and understand the world will naturally influence your actions. So thinking about the world as a place of complexity, where relationships matters, where you want to have an open conversation about things, where you want to build responsibility. This also, I hope, connects with my own actions towards my children and towards other people. And my feeling is that, at least when it comes to my own family, the most important thing I was thinking about when I was raising my children was exactly that. Learning them to think about doing good choices, judgments, to do a good judgment, and reflective choices, that you have to think about things before you do things, and building responsibility. And in that sense, I think it matters how you think about things. If you think about the world as instrumental, you probably will be a rather dangerous person, I think, yeah.
We always also ask for tips on relevant books and articles, because I think many listeners want to explore the discussed topics in more details. So what would you suggest what to read?
I think what you will read will depend a lot of the topic that you are interested in, because of course you have some general theory on complexity. You can find books on that, but mostly people will find it interesting when it's applied in a particular area, and at least in English there is a lot of books on many different topics. But for me personally, I always like reading thinkers and people that have been thinking about this before, and as you said, without using the word complexity, but really talking about complexity. And one of my favorite is the former Czech President Václav Havel, who very interestingly wrote about what happens in a society that is gripped in totalitarianism in the communist era, and that one of the things that was happening was that they tried to remove complexity. And that is the whole point. You try to remove complexity from society, you end up with a totalitarian state. And he has written very much and very interestingly about that, and I recommend for everyone to grab some of the books or articles that he was writing in the 60s and the 70s and 80s when he was a dissident in Czechoslovakia. It's very interesting to read about really the things we are talking about in a particular context there.
Yeah, and especially those people who work in the domains of safety and security, they should, in my opinion, read Stig's newest book by Routledge. So thank you, Stig, for visiting the podcast. Usually, I and Susanna, we don't end this, so it's your job. So any final words for our listeners?
Well, I wouldn't think about any particular things to say other than that if anyone is interested in not thinking about the world as an instrumental mechanical place, they would find much to learn when they start to read about complexity and in different areas, and you will find literature on this in all sorts of areas of life, from us we're talking about philosophy or political science, and all the way into organizational studies and all that. So there's something for every, interested person. So I'm just thankful for having me here and for all who is listening.